He didn't knock, didn't wait. Sheriff Dale Pritchard shoved the door of Rowan's flower shop open so hard the hinges screamed, and every person inside went stone-cold silent. He walked straight to the counter, grabbed the bundle of white lilies Clara had already wrapped and set aside, and threw them onto the floor like they were garbage. "I am done," he said, his voice low and shaking with something uglier than anger. "Watching this town make a saint out of a man who doesn't deserve the ground he walks on." Clara stood behind the counter, her hands pressed flat on the wood, her face white as the petals scattered across the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And that was the moment. Not the flowers hitting the ground, not the sheriff's red-faced rage, not even the gasp that rippled through the room. That was the moment Clara Whitlock finally understood that the quiet cowboy she'd been helping for 3 years was carrying something so much heavier than grief. She just didn't know yet how heavy, or how dangerous. If you've ever kept a promise no one else believed in, stay with me. This story is for you. And before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The first time Clara Whitlock noticed the cowboy, she almost missed him entirely. It was a Friday in early March, and the wind off the open Kansas prairie had teeth that year. The kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it found the spaces between your ribs and settled there. Clara had been standing behind the counter of her late father's flower shop since 7:30 that morning, and by 9:30 she'd sold exactly 1 bundle of dried lavender to old Mrs. Hatch, who bought the same thing every week and never once said thank you. The bell above the door rang at 10:10. He was tall, not the kind of tall that announces itself, but the quiet kind. The kind you notice only when he has to duck slightly under a doorframe, which he did, without thinking, out of what looked like long habit. He wore a coat that had seen better decades, boots caked with the particular red-brown mud that came from the eastern pastures, and a hat he didn't remove when he stepped inside, which Clara noted because her father had always said a man who keeps his hat on indoors is either in a hurry or hiding something. This man didn't look like he was in a hurry. He stood in the middle of the shop for a moment, and he looked at the flowers the way most people look at things they've memorized, not really seeing them anymore, just confirming they're still there. Then he walked to the white lilies. "How much?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man who already knew the answer and was just making sure the world hadn't changed on him overnight, Clara told him. He pulled exact change from his front coat pocket. Not a wallet, just loose coins held together by some private system of order, and set them on the counter without counting them out loud. "Prairie roses, too," he said, "if you have them." She did. She always had them in March because her father had always stocked them in March. And she'd never thought to change that, even 2 years after he was gone. She wrapped the lilies and the roses together in brown paper and tied them with a length of plain twine, because that was how her father had always done it, and something told her this man wasn't the type to want ribbon. He took the bundle. He nodded once, not grateful exactly, more like acknowledging a transaction completed, and then he walked back out into the cold. Clara watched him through the front window. He crossed the street to where a brown horse was tied at the post outside Henderson's hardware store, tucked the flowers carefully under one arm while he untied the reins with the other, and rode east. She didn't think about him again until the following Friday, when he came back. Same time, same coat, same mud on the boots, same flowers. By the third Friday, she knew his schedule better than she knew most of her regular customers. By the 6th, she'd started setting the bundle aside before he arrived, lilies and prairie roses already wrapped in brown paper and tied with plain twine, because it felt strange to make him wait while she assembled something he clearly needed with a kind of quiet urgency she couldn't name. He never told her his name. She found that out from Bess Calloway, who ran the dry goods store 2 doors down and made it her personal mission to know everything about everyone in Grover's Hollow, Kansas, population 400 and change on a good day. "That's Silas Rowan," Bess said one afternoon in April, leaning on Clara's counter with her elbows like she owned the space. "Ranches out east, past the Dunmore property. Keeps to himself. Always has." "Does he have family?" Bess's expression shifted. Not much, just a small tightening around the eyes, the way people look when they know something and are deciding how much of it is theirs to share. "Had a wife," she said finally. Evelyn, sweet woman, died. Oh, it must be 12, 13 years ago now. He never remarried. Clara looked down at the counter and said nothing. People have theories, Bess added, and there was something in her voice that Clara didn't entirely like, a brightness that had nothing to do with warmth. About the flowers, where he takes them. What kind of theories? Oh, you know how people are. Bess waved one hand. Some folks say he's got a woman somewhere nobody knows about. Some folks say he's just... She paused, searching for the diplomatic word and landing several feet away from it. Not right. After Evelyn. Never recovered properly. Clara thought about the way he handled the wrapped flowers. Not rough, not precious, but careful in a way that was so practiced it had become unconscious. Like something he'd done so many times it lived in his hands now, not his head. Maybe, she said, he just knows what he's doing. Bess looked at her like she'd said something mildly confusing. Then she pushed off the counter and straightened her shawl. You'd think after 13 years he'd have moved on, she said, as if that settled something. That's what people do. After she left, Clara stood very still in her empty shop for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had moved on after her mother died. Moved on the way a river moves around a rock, reshaping itself but never once pretending the rock isn't there. She thought about how people talked about grief like it was a season, something you got through and came out the other side of, changed but done. Finished. She had never believed that. She didn't believe it now. The gossip about Silas Rowan ran through Grover's Hollow, the way most gossip did, fast, creative, and deeply comfortable with its own ignorance. Clara heard most of it secondhand. Tom Briggs at the feed store said the cowboy was touched in the head, had been ever since his wife passed, and somebody really ought to look in on him because a man who rides out every Friday alone wasn't right. Ellen Marsh, whose husband had run against the previous sheriff in an election, so uncontested it barely counted as one, said she'd heard Silas was keeping money hidden somewhere on his property, that the flowers were some kind of signal to an accomplice. Clara listened to that one in near disbelief and managed to only say, "Is that so?" which she felt was restrained given the circumstances. The theory she heard most often, though, the one that moved through the town with the persistence of something people wanted to be true, was the romance. A secret woman, a widow somewhere up the North Road, or a rancher's daughter in the next county, and this one had real staying power, a woman in Dodge City that nobody respectable would talk about openly. "He's a man," said one of the men who drank at Haverford's saloon on Thursday nights, in the tone of someone who felt this explained everything. Clara did not frequent Haverford's saloon, but she had ears, and in a town of 400 people, sound traveled. What she noticed, and what nobody else seemed to bother noticing, was the way Silas Rowan looked when he came in on Fridays. Not secretive, not furtive, not like a man hiding something he was ashamed of. He looked, and she turned this observation over in her mind many times before she let herself settle on the word, purposeful. Like a man who knew exactly where he was going and had made his peace with the distance. There was a grief in him, yes. She could see that. It wasn't the violent kind, the kind that made men loud or reckless or mean. It was the old kind, the kind that had been living inside a person so long it had started to look, from the outside, like simply the way they were built. She did not ask him where he took the flowers. For 3 years, she did not ask. She almost didn't ask the fourth time either. It was a Tuesday in late October, which mattered because he never came in on Tuesdays, and she almost didn't recognize him at first because he came in without the coat. Just a worn flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and a look on his face that was different from his Friday face. Tighter, like something inside him had been pulled several notches beyond where it was meant to go. "I need flowers," he said. "For Friday." "It's Tuesday," she said, before she could stop herself. He looked at her. First time he'd really looked at her directly, she realized. Usually his eyes went to the flowers first and then, if necessary, to the person behind them. His eyes were a color she'd describe later, privately, only to herself, as the gray of a Kansas sky about 20 minutes before it decides what it's going to do. "I know what day it is," he said. Not unkindly, just stating a fact. "Is something wrong with Friday?" The question felt strange in her mouth, too personal, but she'd already said it. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, that he would do what he always did, complete the transaction, and leave without offering her anything of himself that wasn't strictly required. "I might not be here Friday," he said. She waited. "There's a dispute about the eastern fence line. Pritchard's been—" He stopped. Started again, differently. "I just need this flowers ready early." Clara had heard the name Pritchard before. Sheriff Dale Pritchard had been the law in Grover's Hollow for going on 9 years. And he was the kind of man who wore authority the way some men wore a new suit, self-consciously, always checking to make sure other people were noticing it. She'd never had a reason to think about him particularly, one way or another. She thought about him now. "I'll have them ready Tuesday evening," she said. "You can pick them up before you ride out." He looked at her again, that same direct look, like he was recalibrating something. "Thank you," he said. And this time it wasn't the acknowledging a transaction thank you. It was something else. Something that landed differently. He came back Tuesday evening and picked up the bundle without incident, and she watched him through the window again as he rode east, and she noticed something she hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let herself notice. He rode with the flowers held against his chest. Not under his arm. Against his chest with one hand, like something that needed protecting from the wind. That night, Clara Whitlock made a decision she wouldn't fully understand until much later. She decided she was going to ask him. She didn't get the chance that week. He didn't come in Friday. He didn't come in the following Friday either, and by the third absent Friday she'd convinced herself she'd imagined the whole thing, the Tuesday visit, the tight look on his face, the flowers held against his chest like armor. Then, on a gray November morning with the first real threat of snow in the air, he walked through the door and she saw immediately that something had happened. He was carrying himself differently. Not injured, nothing physical, but like something had recently tested his ability to stay upright and he hadn't entirely passed. She put the bundle on the counter without a word. He set the coins down. She made herself say it before she could unmake the decision. "Where do you take them?" He went still. Not startled. More like a man who has been waiting for a question for a long time and is now deciding in real time whether the person asking it deserves an answer. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "It's none of my business." "A hill," he said, "east of the Dunmore property." She waited, because something in the way he'd said it told her there was more. "My wife is buried there." He picked up the flowers from the counter. She liked lilies. Prairie roses were her favorite in spring. She said— He stopped, cleared his throat. She said they smelled like the world was trying again. Clara felt something happen in her chest. Not a clean feeling, one of those feelings with edges. "I made her a promise," Silas said, and his voice had dropped low enough that she had to lean slightly forward to hear it. "That I'd bring her flowers every Friday. That I'd tell her everything that happened that week. Every good thing, every bad thing, everything ordinary." He looked at the wrapped bundle in his hands. "She said she didn't want me to go quiet after she was gone." He looked up. His eyes met hers. "I haven't," he said simply. "Gone quiet." And then he nodded. His regular nod, the transaction complete nod, and walked out. Clara stood behind her counter in her empty shop and felt the silence of the room change around her. Not heavier exactly, fuller. She thought about a woman named Evelyn who had loved prairie roses because they smelled like the world was trying again. She thought about a man who had been keeping a promise for 13 years, alone, without anyone to witness it or applaud it or tell him it was meaningful. Without, apparently, even wanting those things. She thought about the way people in this town had been talking about him. Her jaw tightened. She picked up the coins he'd left, the exact amount, always exact, and put them in the register, and she made herself a second decision in as many months. From this point forward, she was not going to let Silas Rowan pay for those flowers. She wasn't sure yet how to tell him that without him refusing. She wasn't sure yet whether she'd follow him to that hill or whether that was something too private, too much like intrusion. She didn't know yet what was coming, Pritchard and the fence dispute and the thing that would happen in late winter that would split this town in two and then, somehow, put it back together differently. She didn't know any of it yet. What she knew was this. A man had made a promise to a woman who smelled like trying again, and he had kept it, quietly, without anyone's permission, for 13 years. She knew this was the bravest thing she had ever heard of in her life. And she knew that whatever came next, whatever Pritchard was building toward, whatever the town was whispering, whatever weight Silas Rowan was carrying on those Friday rides east, She was not going to be the kind of person who let it happen from a distance. The wind hit the front window of the shop and made the old glass rattle in its frame. Clara looked at the petals on the floor, a few white ones fallen from the wrapping, and left them there. Some things, she was learning, you didn't sweep away before they were finished being what they were. She left the petals on the floor until closing time. That probably said something about her, though she wasn't entirely sure what. Maybe that she'd gotten sentimental in her old age. She was 28, which wasn't old by any reasonable measure, but running a shop alone for 2 years had a way of aging a person in the places that didn't show. Or maybe it said something simpler, that she understood, without being able to articulate it cleanly, that some things deserved to stay a little longer than was practical. She swept them up at 10 minutes to 6, locked the front door, and stood in the near dark of her father's shop. Her shop, she still had to remind herself, her shop now, and thought about a hill east of the Dunmore property where a man had been talking to his dead wife for 13 years. She thought about that for a long time. Then she put on her coat and went home. The decision she'd made about the flowers, about not charging him, ran into its first problem the following Friday when Silas came in, set his coins on the counter as he always did, and reached for the bundle before she could say anything. She had rehearsed several versions of the conversation. None of them had accounted for how fast he moved when he'd already decided what he was doing. "Wait," she said. He waited, barely. "I'm not going to charge you anymore." She kept her voice even. "For the flowers." He looked at the coins on the counter, then at her. Then at the coins again, like he was working through a problem in his head that didn't have a clean solution. "That's not necessary," he said. "I didn't say it was necessary. I can pay." "I know you can pay." A pause. The wind found a gap somewhere in the front wall and made a thin sound, not quite a whistle. "Then why?" he said, and the question was careful, suspicious in the way of a man who'd had generosity used against him before. "Would you not charge me?" Clara looked at him straight on. "Because you've been keeping a promise for 13 years, and nobody in this town has done anything to make that easier. And this is the one thing I can do, so I'm doing it." She took a breath. "You can be annoyed about it if you want. That won't change my mind." He stared at her. It was the longest he'd ever looked at her directly, and she'd already noted that his direct look was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that didn't look away and didn't offer you anything to hide behind. "I'm not annoyed," he said finally. "Good." Another pause. He picked up the flowers, left the coins on the counter. "I'll still pay," he said. "I'll still put it back in the till under your name and donate it to the Holloway Orphans Fund at end of year." He stopped at the door. "That's a strange thing to do with a man's money." "I'm a strange woman," she said. "Ask anyone in town." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of the memory of one, testing the space to see if it still fit. Then he was gone, and she stood in her shop with his coins on the counter and the feeling she'd said 3 times as many words to him in the last 2 minutes as she had in the previous 4 years combined. She put the coins in the till under R for Rowan and wrote the amount in her father's old ledger in the column she'd quietly relabeled 2 months ago, from miscellaneous to things that matter. She was, as she'd said, a strange woman. Plus, November gave way to December in the way Kansas Decembers came. Not gradually, but all at once, like the prairie had simply decided it was done pretending. The roads hardened overnight. The sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way. People moved through town faster, heads down, the social machinery of a small frontier community grinding through the season with the particular grim efficiency of people who knew a hard winter when they felt one coming. Silas kept coming on Fridays. Clara kept having the flowers ready. What changed, incrementally, the way things change when 2 people are in the same small room on a regular basis and the pretense of being strangers becomes too much effort, what changed was that he started talking. Not much. Not in the confessional way he'd talked that November morning when he'd told her about the hill, but small things, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. The cattle were doing well despite the cold. One of his fence posts on the northwest line had rotted through and he'd replaced it himself because the man he'd hired to help around the property had left for Wichita in October, and he hadn't found anyone reliable since. The Dunmore brothers were talking about selling their land, which would change the whole character of the Eastern Territory if whoever bought it didn't understand what they were dealing with. Clara listened. She was good at listening, had been, her father always said, since before she could talk, which he'd meant as a compliment and she'd taken as one. She told him small things back. A shipment of flowers from a grower in Missouri had arrived half frozen, and she'd lost nearly a third of it. Mrs. Hatch had finally said thank you last week, after 2 years of dried lavender purchases and complete silence, and Clara had been so surprised she'd given her an extra stem for free. The roof above the back room was developing an ambition to become a skylight, slowly, whether she wanted it to or not. "You need someone to look at that," he said one Friday in mid-December. "I need someone to look at that and be willing to do it for something other than cash I don't have until spring," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I can look at it." She opened her mouth to say something about not needing charity, then remembered she'd already made that speech from the other side and didn't have standing to give it again. "All right," she said. He came by on a Wednesday, another non-Friday appearance, which she was learning meant something had shifted in his internal accounting of what their acquaintance was, and spent 2 hours on her roof in weather that would have driven most men inside after 20 minutes. And when he came down, he told her she needed 2 new boards along the north edge, and the flashing around the chimney was pulling loose. "Can you fix it?" she asked. "Already did," he said. She made coffee. He stood in her back room with his coat dripping on the floor, holding the mug with both hands the way people hold things when they're cold all the way through. And she realized it was the first time she'd ever seen him anywhere other than the shop floor. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent so long in his own space that other people's spaces didn't quite fit him right. Not uncomfortable exactly, but aware, like a large piece of furniture that knows it's taking up room. "Thank you," she said. He drank his coffee. "Thank you for the flowers," he said, which was not something he'd ever said before, and she understood he wasn't talking about that day's transaction. They stood in her back room in a silence that was not, for the first time, the silence of two people who didn't know each other. It was Bess Calloway who first said it out loud, though Clara suspected she wasn't the first to think it. "People are talking," Bess said, appearing at Clara's counter on a Thursday morning in January, with the energy of someone delivering news they'd worked hard to remain neutral about. "About you and the Rowan man." Clara looked up from the inventory she was attempting to reconcile. "Talking what?" "That he's been to your shop on non-Fridays, that he fixed your roof." Bess's expression was careful. "That you've stopped charging him." "I donate the money to the Holloway Fund." "Clara," Bess leaned forward, "I'm not judging. I'm telling you because I think you ought to know before you're the last person in the county who doesn't." "Know what exactly?" "People think—" Bess paused, chose a direction, went with it. "People think he's strange, and people think you're encouraging strange." Clara set down her pencil very deliberately. "Bess, a man brings flowers to his dead wife's grave every Friday and has done so for 13 years. What is strange about that?" Bess had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "It's the talking to her. That's what people say, that he talks to her up there." "He told her he would?" Clara heard her own voice go flat in a way it didn't often go. She didn't want him to go quiet, so he doesn't go quiet. That's not strange. That's a person doing what they said they'd do. Bess was quiet for a moment. Then, more softly, "You've gotten fond of him." Clara picked her pencil back up. "I've gotten fond of a man who keeps his promises. If that makes me strange by this town's standards, I can live with that." After Bess left, Clara sat with the inventory untouched for a while. She thought about what Bess had said. Not the gossip part, but the underneath of it, the part that Bess had been too careful to say directly. "You've gotten fond of him." As though that were a problem. As though caring about a person, understanding something true about them, were a thing to be warned away from. She thought about Evelyn Rowan, who had loved prairie roses and made her husband promise not to go quiet. She thought about what it must have been like, being loved by a man like Silas. Loved in that absolute unreasonable 13 years of frozen Friday mornings way. Whether it would feel like a gift or a weight or some complicated thing that was both at once, depending on the day. She thought, "I've never been loved like that." Then she thought, "Most people haven't." Then she made herself go back to the inventory because the lilies weren't going to count themselves. The trouble with Sheriff Dale Pritchard didn't arrive without warning. Like most trouble, it had been building for a while in the background, quiet enough that you could mistake it for normal noise until the moment it wasn't. Clara had caught pieces of it, the way you catch pieces of a conversation happening in the next room. The fence dispute Silas had mentioned in October, something about water rights that Pritchard was involving himself in, which was, by any objective reading of the law, somewhat outside a sheriff's jurisdiction. The way Pritchard's name came up around Silas in conversations that had a particular quality, not quite threatening, but leaning. She'd asked Silas about it, carefully, one Friday in February, when he'd come in looking like a man who'd had a very long week and was not yet at the end of it. "Is the fence situation resolved?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Pritchard's saying the Eastern Line was always his family's, that my deed's wrong." "Is it?" "The deed's been in the county records since 1871. He looked at the flowers on the counter. "My father's name is on it." "Then what's Pritchard's argument?" "His argument is that he's the sheriff." Something crossed his face. Not anger, not exactly. More like a tiredness that had been sitting behind his eyes long enough that it had started to feel structural. "And that I'm an old widower with no family left to make noise on his behalf." Clara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the February air. "That's not an argument," she said. "That's a threat." "Yes," he said simply. "It is." He picked up the flowers. He left, and Clara stood in her empty shop and felt the specific, particular anger of someone watching an unfair thing assemble itself, piece by piece, in slow motion. She knew that kind of anger. She'd felt it when her father's illness had taken 2 years to end him, and the doctors in Dodge City had said sorry in the particular way of people who mean there's nothing to be done, and what they're really saying is there's nothing worth our time being done. She'd felt it when she'd tried to keep the shop going after, and the bank had looked at a young woman alone behind a counter and done the math they'd already decided on before she'd opened her mouth. That anger wasn't loud. That was the thing about it. It didn't shout. It just went very, very still and waited. Pritchard came into the shop for the first time on a Thursday in late February. Clara was alone. This was usual. She was almost always alone, which was one of the quieter realities of her life that she'd learned not to think about too directly. He was a large man who wore his size as though he'd practiced making it take up as much room as possible. The star on his coat was polished to a degree that suggested either great personal pride or a significant amount of time with nothing better to do. He stood in the middle of her shop with his hands on his hips and looked around with the slow, deliberate gaze of a man who wanted you to know he was assessing things. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Sheriff." She kept her voice even, customer voice, shop voice, the voice her father had taught her. Not rude, not warm, just professional. Clara, professional covers a lot of ground. "Heard you've been doing business with Silas Rowan." "I do business with most of the county," she said. "That's what a shop is for." Something moved behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe, but the cold kind. The kind that isn't related to anything actually being funny. "I heard you've been giving him flowers for free." "I donate the amount to charity on his behalf. It's a personal business decision." He moved to the display near the window and picked up a stem of dried eucalyptus, turned it over in his fingers without any apparent interest in it. "Rowan's a troubled man, Miss Whitlock. I don't know if you know his full history." "I know enough of it." "He had some difficulties. After his wife." Pritchard set the eucalyptus down, not where he'd picked it up from. "Mental difficulties. People in town worried about him for a while. I worry about him still." Clara looked at the eucalyptus, out of place on the wrong shelf, and felt the anger do its quiet thing. Go still, go deep. "In what way do you worry about him, Sheriff?" she asked. "A man who talks to a grave every week isn't entirely stable." He shrugged. One shoulder, very casual. "I'd hate for a young woman alone in a shop to be taken advantage of by someone who isn't reliable." The word reliable sat in the air between them, doing a job that wasn't the job of the word reliable. "Thank you for your concern," Clara said. "Is there something I can help you with today? Flowers, perhaps? We have some very nice winter arrangements." He looked at her for a moment. The professional smile she'd put on was a thing she'd inherited from her father along with the shop, and it was, she'd found, remarkably effective at ending conversations that needed ending. "Just a friendly visit," he said. He walked to the door, stopped. "You know, there's going to be some reorganization of land in the Eastern Territory, county business. It might affect some of the smaller ranches out that way. He didn't look at her when he said it, just talked to the door. Rowan's, for example. He left. Clara stood very still in the aftermath of him for several seconds. Then she went to the back room, sat down on the stool her father had always kept there for when his feet hurt, and put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed through her nose until the stillness in her became something she could direct, instead of something that was just happening to her. She thought about the deed from 1871, about Silas's father's name on it, about the word reliable doing the work of a threat in a polished star voice. She thought about Evelyn Rowan, who had made her husband promise not to go quiet, and about how that promise was going to matter more in the coming months than either of them had known when she'd asked for it. And she thought, with a clarity she hadn't expected, someone needs to help him. The question was how, and how much. She followed him on a Friday in early March. She'd argued herself in and out of it 6 or 7 times over the preceding 2 weeks. It felt like an intrusion. It was an intrusion. He hadn't invited her. He hadn't even hinted that an invitation was something he'd considered. The hill east of the Dunmore property was his place, his and Evelyn's. And showing up there uninvited felt like the kind of thing that couldn't be undone once done. But Pritchard's visit had changed something in her sense of what was necessary, and she'd started thinking about the fact that Silas had no one, no family, no one who knew where he went on Fridays, what it meant, why it mattered. If Pritchard made his move, whatever move he was assembling, piece by piece, in the background, there'd be no one to say, this man matters, what he does matters, the thing he's been keeping alive out there on that hill matters. Someone needed to know. Not to tell the town, though Clara was beginning to think the town needed to know, whether it wanted to or not, but just to have seen it, to be a witness. She waited until she could see his horse a fair distance ahead on the east road. Then she followed on the old gray mare she kept in the shed behind the shop, more out of sentiment than practical need. Her father's horse. Slower than Silas's brown by a comfortable margin, which suited her. She wasn't trying to catch up, just to follow. The Dunmore property was 2 miles east of town, and beyond it the land opened up in a way that always surprised her slightly, no matter how many times she saw it. The prairie stretching to a horizon so flat and wide it made you feel simultaneously very small and somehow very free, like the world had taken a breath and was holding it. She saw the hill before she saw him. It wasn't dramatic, Kansas hills rarely are. Just a gentle rise in the flat ground, an old oak tree at the top that was bare and wide-armed in the March wind, and at the base of the tree, 2 stones, simple ones, the kind a man would choose himself rather than commission from someone who made them for a living. He was sitting on the ground beside them. She pulled up on the mare at a distance and watched. He had his hat off. The wind was doing what the Kansas wind does in March, testing everything, looking for weaknesses. And his hair moved in it, gray at the temples in a way she hadn't noticed before because she'd always seen him in his hat. He was talking. She couldn't hear the words from where she was, and she didn't try to get closer. That wasn't why she'd come. She'd come to see it, not to hear it. She watched him put the flowers against the stone on the left, watched him arrange them with that same careful but not precious attention she'd observed when he carried them. He talked for a while longer, then went quiet and just sat there with his hand resting on top of the stone, not grabbing it, not pressing it, just present. The way you rest your hand on a friend's shoulder when there's nothing left to say, and your being there is the whole of what you have to offer. Clara felt something break open in her chest, quietly, without drama. Not the romantic kind. Something older. Something that had to do with the specific courage of people who love without an audience, without acknowledgement, without any of the machinery the world usually uses to tell you that what you're doing counts. She turned the mare around before he stood up. She rode back to town with the wind in her face and her eyes stinging, which she attributed entirely to the weather. She didn't tell him she'd gone. Not that week, and not the following week, and not in March at all. Some things, she'd decided, belonged to the category of things a person needed to hold on to for a while before they gave them words. The vision of him on that hill, hat off, hand on the stone, talking to someone who had been gone for 13 years. She wasn't ready to turn it into a sentence yet. What she did do was start paying attention differently. Not to him specifically, or not only to him, but to the way the town had organized itself around its idea of who he was. The whispers. The theories. The slight but consistent way people's expressions shifted when his name came up. that small rearrangement of features that meant, oh yes, the strange one. She started noticing who repeated those things and who didn't, who went quiet when someone said something unkind and who laughed. She wasn't keeping a list, she wasn't that deliberate about it, but she was building a picture, a map of the town's moral geography, where the decent people were, where the people were who thought decency was fine in principle but inconvenient in practice. She was building it because she thought she might need it. Pritchard came back to the shop in mid-March. This time he didn't bother with the friendly visit framing. "There's going to be a hearing," he said, standing in the middle of her floor in that same wide-stance, room-filling way. "County Commissioner's office, about the eastern land boundaries. Rowan's going to be asked to provide documentation." "His deed is in the county records," Clara said, "from 1871. Something shifted in Pritchard's face. "County records have gaps. It's a very old document." He paused. "Very old things sometimes don't hold up the way we think they will." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, and now the pleasantness was gone, just gone, like a coat someone had taken off because it was too warm for it, "that a man who has no family, no lawyer, and no friends with influence in this county is going to have a very hard time arguing for 40 acres of eastern grazing land against a family that's been part of this community for 30 years. Clara looked at him. "The Pritchard family has been here 30 years, she said. "The Rowan deed is from 1871. That's 53 years by my count." He smiled. It was the least warm smile she'd ever seen on a human face. "Miss Whitlock, I came here as a courtesy, to let you know that your association with this man may not be in your best interest going forward. This is a small town. People remember who stood where." She was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the courtesy," she said, "and I'll return it. I know 6 people on that county commission. My father knew 12. He kept very detailed records of who owed what to whom, which was a habit I inherited along with this shop." She kept her voice even, customer voice, shop voice, the voice that covered a lot of ground. "I also know that deeds from 1871 are public documents, and that any attempt to dispute one would require a legal process that would be visible to anyone who wanted to look at it." She tilted her head slightly. "I do a lot of reading, Sheriff. I have a lot of evenings alone." Pritchard's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, became something less comfortable, like a garment that had been the right size yesterday and wasn't quite anymore. "Good day, Miss Whitlock," he said. "Good day, Sheriff." After he left, she sat down on the stool in the back room again, because her legs had decided they were done, pretending the last 5 minutes hadn't happened, and she put her hands on her thighs again and breathed. She had bluffed about her father's records. Some of it was true. He had known most of the commission members, and he had been a man who paid attention to detail. But she didn't actually know what was in his records, because she hadn't gone through them fully. Because going through them fully meant going through everything of his, and she hadn't been ready for that in 2 years of being alone in this shop, and she wasn't sure she was ready now. She was going to have to get ready. She stood up, went to the back corner where her father's old desk sat under a canvas tarp she'd put over it the month after he died and hadn't moved since, and she pulled the tarp off. Dust rose in a cloud. The desk underneath was exactly as he'd left it, papers stacked in his particular organized seeming but actually systematic way. Ledgers lined up by year, a tin mug he'd used for pencils still holding pencils. She sat down in his chair. It was the first time she'd sat in it. She opened the top drawer. She started reading. She read until the light outside the back window went from gray afternoon to blue-gray dusk to full dark, and by the time she lit the lamp, she had found 3 things her father had known about Dale Pritchard's family and their relationship to the county commission that were, to put it in the precise terms she would have used if she'd been talking to anyone but herself, extraordinarily useful. She closed the drawer. She sat in the dark with the lamp burning low on the desk. She thought about Silas Rowan on that hill, talking to a woman who'd told him not to go quiet, who'd said prairie roses smelled like the world was trying again. She thought, the world is going to have to try very hard. She thought, so am I. And somewhere out east, in the cold and the dark, a man rode home alone from a hill where 2 stones sat under a wide-armed oak, and the wind moved the bare branches above them, and the flowers she had wrapped in brown paper and tied with plain twine bent in it and held. She told him on a Friday. Not everything. Not the bluff she'd made to Pritchard, not the lamp burning low over her father's desk, Not the three things she'd found in the top drawer that had kept her awake until 2 in the morning, turning them over in her mind. Not yet. She told him the part he needed to know first, which was the simple mechanical fact. Pritchard was moving against the deed. There would be a hearing. He needed to be ready. Silas stood at her counter with the wrapped flowers in his hands and listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was his way. He didn't fill silence with noise while he was thinking, didn't nod along to show he was following. He just listened, all the way through, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. "I know," he said. Clara stopped. "You know about the hearing?" "I know he's been talking to the commissioner's office. Hank Dunmore told me last week. Hank's got a brother who works county records." He looked at the flowers. "I've been waiting to see what shape it was going to take." "What shape it's going to take," she repeated. "Silas, he came into my shop twice. He's not doing this quietly." "No," he agreed, "he isn't." "Then why are you—" She stopped herself, started again. "What's your plan?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might say he didn't have one. Instead he said, "I've got the original deed. I've got my father's survey notes from when the line was drawn. And I've got a letter from the county surveyor from 1889 confirming the eastern boundary after a dispute with the Mercer family that Pritchard's people seem to have forgotten about." Clara stared at him. "You have all of that?" "In a box under my bed," he said. "Yes." "Then why haven't you—" She pressed her lips together. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He looked at her with that steady, unhurried gaze. "Who would I have told?" The question sat between them and did its work. She felt it, the specific shape of it. Not accusatory, not self-pitying, just accurate. A man who had been living alone for 13 years, who had made his life small and self-contained out of what she was beginning to understand, was equal parts grief and the practical experience of not having anyone to make it larger with. Who would he have told? "You could have told me," she said, and then immediately felt the slight absurdity of it. She was a florist who had been donating his flower money to an orphan's fund without his permission, not his lawyer. Something moved in his face that might, on a different face in a different moment, have been close to warmth. "I'm telling you now," he said. She let out a breath. "All right. Then here's what I'm telling you. My father knew things about the Pritchard family and their relationship to the county commission. Things that would make any commissioner think twice about being visibly partial in a land dispute. I found them in his desk." Silas was very still. "What kind of things?" "The kind that don't need to be said out loud in a public hearing," she said. "The kind that just need to be known to be effective." He looked at her for a long moment. "You'd do that." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "I'd do that," she said. He picked up the flowers. He went to the door. He stopped there. At the door, the way he sometimes did, in that threshold space between being somewhere and going somewhere, and said, without turning around, "Evelyn would have liked you." He was gone before she could decide what to do with that. She stood in her shop for a good 2 minutes doing nothing in particular, which was not something she normally did, and then she went and made a list of everything she needed to do before the county hearing, which was set for the first week of April, which was 18 days away, which was not very many. She made the list very long. Making long lists was how she did not think about things she was not ready to think about yet. The next 18 days had a particular quality to them, the quality of a spring that was trying to happen in spite of a winter that wasn't ready to let go. The weather came in waves, 2 warm days that smelled like mud and possibility, then a hard frost that killed the new growth and left everything glazed and brittle, then warm again, uncertain, the whole prairie cycling through its argument with itself about what season it intended to be. Clara worked. She went through her father's records in full. Every page, every ledger, every scrap of paper he'd kept in the systematic way he'd had, which was to say, not always obviously ordered, but never without a reason. It took her 4 evenings and most of a Saturday. What she found was not exactly what she'd expected, which was to say, it was both more and less, more detail, more names, more dates than she'd thought he'd kept track of. Less dramatic than she'd built it into in her head in the days since finding the first 3 items. Her father had been, above all things, a careful man. He'd written down what he'd seen and heard without embellishment and without apparent agenda, just recording the world as it came to him, which meant that what he'd left behind was more useful than anything constructed. It was simply true. There was a note, dated 1915, about a conversation he'd witnessed between Commissioner Aldous Webb and a man named Pritchard, not Dale, his father, Harold, regarding a water rights allocation on the North Creek that had been awarded, per the official record, in open competition, and per her father's note, after a dinner at the Pritchard Ranch that the commissioner had initially declined to attend and then somehow attended. There was a letter, never sent, that her father had drafted to the county records office asking for clarification on the legal boundary of the Rowan land, which meant her father had known about this dispute, or one like it, before it became one. And there was, tucked between 2 pages of a 1919 ledger, a folded piece of paper that was not in her father's handwriting, which turned out to be a copy of a letter from the state land office in Topeka to a James Aldous Webb, the commissioner's son, currently serving on the same commission as his father had, gently but specifically noting that any land boundary dispute involving pre-1880 deeds required independent state review before county resolution. That last one was the one that mattered most. She held it in her hands at 2 a.m. with the lamp burning and her father's chair solid under her, and she thought, he saved this for a reason. She didn't know if he'd saved it for this reason specifically. Her father had been a man who collected information the way other men collected tools, not knowing exactly when a given thing would be useful, but understanding that useful things should not be thrown away. But she thought, he saved it, and now I have it. And it means that any commissioner who wants to rule on the Rowan deed quickly and quietly and without outside oversight is going to have to explain why they think the state land office's own policy doesn't apply. She made a copy in her own hand. She put the original back in the ledger exactly where she'd found it. She slept 4 hours and woke up feeling not rested, but resolved, which was a different thing and, for her purposes, sufficient. She went to see Silas the following Sunday. Not a Friday, not a transaction, just a visit, the first time she'd been to the ranch in the 4 years she'd known him. She rode the gray mare east, past the Dunmore property, past the rise where the Dunmore brothers' old barn was slowly losing its argument with gravity, and then further east where the road narrowed to a track, and the track eventually opened onto a stretch of flat land with a low house and a barn in better shape than most, and a fence line that was, she noted, in excellent repair. He was at the fence when she arrived. Working, not waiting, she'd sent no word ahead, which she'd considered and then decided against on the grounds that if she'd sent word, she'd have spent the whole ride there second-guessing herself. He saw her coming from a distance and stood still until she reached him, hat in his hand, which was something she noted because she'd rarely seen him without it. "Clara," he said. Nobody in this town called her by her first name without being asked. She'd been Miss Whitlock to everyone since her father died, including people who'd known her since she was 7 years old. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she didn't mind it from him. "I found something," she said, and dismounted, and told him about the state land office letter while the gray mare stood between them with the patient indifference of an animal that had carried people through difficult conversations before and knew enough to stay out of it. He read the copy she'd made. He read it twice. He handed it back. "Your father kept this," he said. "He kept everything," she said. "I'm only beginning to understand why." Silas looked out at the fence line, at the eastern horizon beyond it. The morning was one of the warm ones, that uncertain prairie spring warmth that felt borrowed rather than earned. "My father and yours were friends," he said. "Did you know that?" She hadn't known that. "No, not close friends. But they knew each other. Your father came out here once, years ago, when I was maybe 10 or 12. I remember him because he shook my hand like I was a grown man and nobody did that." He looked at the paper in her hand. "Maybe he kept it because he knew, the way your father seemed to know things, that the Rowan land was going to be fought over eventually." "Land always gets fought over eventually," Clara said, "when it's worth something." "Ours is worth something," he said. "Not proud about it, just a fact. Good grazing east of the creek, water that doesn't dry up in August. There aren't many pieces like it left in this county." "I know." She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. "The hearing is in 11 days. You need to bring your deed, your father's survey notes, the 1889 surveyor's letter, and this. I'll come with you." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She put her foot back in the stirrup and pulled herself up onto the mare with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it since childhood, and had never pretended it was elegant. "I'll be there. If they have questions about my father's records, I can answer them. And if they have questions about the state land office policy, I can answer those too. And if they have questions about why a flower shop owner is present at a county land hearing, I'll tell them I'm a tax-paying citizen who reads the relevant statutes and leave it at that." He was quiet. The wind moved the dry grass at the edge of his fence line. "Why?" he said. Not suspicious this time, just asking. She looked at him from on top of the mare, and she thought about how to answer that. And she decided on the honest version rather than the practical one, because she'd spent too much of the last 2 years being practical about things that deserved better. "Because you've been keeping a promise in this county for 13 years, and no one has done a single thing to make it easier," she said, "and I'm tired of being in that number." She turned the mare and rode back toward town, and she didn't look back, which was something she'd learned from her father. When you've said the true thing, you don't need to watch it land. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April. The county commissioner's office was in a 2-story building on the main road that had originally been built as a general store and still had the ghost of its previous life in the proportions of its windows, too wide and low for an official building, like a place that had been repurposed without being fully convinced. Clara arrived before Silas. She sat in the second row of the public gallery with her father's copy of the state land office letter in her coat pocket, and her hands folded on her lap and her back straight, which was a posture she'd inherited from her mother and deployed in situations that required the appearance of more certainty than she actually possessed. There were more people in the gallery than she'd expected. She recognized Tom Briggs from the feed store, and Hank Dunmore, and 2 of the Mercer brothers whose family had been the other party in the 1889 boundary dispute. There were people she didn't recognize, which meant they'd come from further out, which meant word had spread in ways she hadn't tracked. Pritchard was already there. He was sitting at the front with a man in a suit that announced itself as Wichita Money, which meant he'd brought a lawyer, which meant he'd taken this seriously from the beginning, regardless of his casual posture in her shop. Silas came in at 8 minutes past 9, which was 2 minutes before the commissioners took their seats. And the fact that he was almost late was so unlike the disciplined, prompt man she'd come to know that she looked at him carefully when he sat down beside her, and saw in his face the particular quality of someone who had been awake all night and had decided not to let it show and was not entirely succeeding. "Did you sleep?" she said quietly. "Some," he said, which she interpreted as no. "Do you have everything?" He patted the inside of his coat. "Everything." Commissioner Aldous Webb, the son, not the father, though looking at him, Clara thought the apple had not traveled far, called the proceeding to order with the slightly bored efficiency of a man who had decided the outcome before walking in and was going through the necessary motions with the minimum required investment. He was 60, maybe more, with the softness around the jaw of someone who'd eaten well his whole life and the eyes of someone who'd made a lot of decisions other people had to live with. Pritchard's lawyer went first. He was good. Clara could admit that, the way you can admit something is well made even when it's being used against someone you care about. He had a survey of his own, conducted 6 months prior, that placed the Pritchard family's claimed boundary 200 yards further west than the Rowan deed specified. He had statements from 2 neighboring landowners, names Clara didn't recognize, supporting the Pritchard position. He spoke for 20 minutes in the measured, confident tone of someone who expected the room to follow him and had rarely been disappointed. Then Silas spoke. He was not a lawyer. He had no training in it, no experience with this kind of proceeding, no polished Wichita diction to smooth the edges of his sentences. He stood up with his deed in one hand and his father's survey notes in the other, and he talked the way he did everything, quietly, without performance, in the direct, unornamented way of a man who had been out in the weather long enough to know that the weather didn't care how well you phrased things. He laid out the deed. He read the boundary lines from his father's survey. He presented the 1889 surveyor's letter, which made Commissioner Webb sit slightly straighter in a way that Clara clocked and filed. Then Silas said, "There's also a matter of the State Land Office's review requirement for pre-1880 deeds." Webb's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. "That policy," began Pritchard's lawyer, "applies to this dispute," Silas said. "I have a copy of the relevant letter if the commission would like to see it." He looked at Clara. She took the paper from her coat pocket and walked it to the front of the room, set it on the commissioner's table, and walked back to her seat without saying a word. She felt Pritchard's eyes on her the whole way. Webb read the letter. He read it with the elaborate casualness of someone pretending it was not the thing they were most focused on. He passed it to the two commissioners on either side of him. One of them read it and looked at the ceiling. The other one read it and looked at Pritchard. The hearing recessed for 45 minutes. Clara and Silas sat in the public gallery and did not talk. There was nothing useful to say in a recess, she'd decided. You'd either done enough or you hadn't, and talking about it while you waited didn't change which one was true. Bess Calloway slid into the seat beside Clara during the recess, which Clara hadn't anticipated. I came to watch, Bess said, in a tone that was different from her usual tone, smaller somehow, less self-satisfied. Hank Dunmore told me what Pritchard's been doing. I didn't... She stopped, started again. I didn't know it had gotten this far. It's been getting this far for a while, Clara said, keeping her voice even. I know. Bess looked at her hands. I know I said things. About Rowan. About him being strange. She paused. I wasn't kind. No, Clara agreed. You weren't. There was a silence. Bess didn't fill it with an excuse, which Clara noted and gave her credit for. Is he going to be all right? Bess asked. I think so, Clara said. Today, anyway. When the commission reconvened, Webb had the look of a man who had made a calculation and didn't love the result but had decided it was the only result he could live with publicly. He ruled that the State Land Office review requirement applied. He ruled that the Pritchard family's claim could not be resolved at the county level until that review was completed. He recommended a 6-month stay of any further proceedings while the state office was contacted. It wasn't a victory exactly. Clara had known it probably wouldn't be. These things rarely ended cleanly, the way real things rarely ended cleanly. But it was time. It was the door staying open instead of closing. It was Silas Rowan keeping his land for at least 6 more months, which meant 6 more months of Friday mornings riding east with brown paper and plain twine. She'd take it. Outside on the steps of this commissioner's building. In the pale April sunlight, Silas stood with his documents under his arm and looked out at the main road of Grover's Hollow as if he was seeing it from a slight distance. Pritchard and his lawyer had left without speaking to anyone, which Clara read as the specific fury of a man who'd expected to win and hadn't. 6 months, Silas said. 6 months, she confirmed. And then? And then the state office will rule, and their ruling will be based on the original deed, the 1889 surveyor's letter, and your father's notes. She paused. And if Webb tries to interfere with that process, I have 3 more things from my father's desk that I haven't used yet. He looked at her sideways. How many things did your father know? A remarkable number, she said. He was a very quiet man who paid a great deal of attention. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, you bluffed him, Pritchard, in your shop when you told him you knew the commission members. She didn't ask how he'd figured that out. Partially bluffed, she said. My father did know most of them. The records are real. But you didn't know what was in them when you said it. No, she admitted. I didn't. He nodded slowly, and in his face was something she hadn't seen before, something that might have been, in a less contained man, expressed as admiration, but in Silas came out as a kind of recognition, the look of someone seeing a quality in another person that rhymes with something in themselves. Evelyn did that too, he said something true in a direction she was still figuring out. Clara felt the morning air on her face and said nothing, because some things you received quietly or not at all. Hank Dunmore came over to shake Silas's hand, and then 2 of the Mercer brothers, and then Tom Briggs, which surprised Clara more than she expected. Tom Briggs, who had called Silas touched in the head at his feed store, who was now shaking the man's hand with the slightly overcorrected warmth of someone atoning for a thing he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. She watched Silas with these men, watched him accept their handshakes with the same level, undemonstrative quality he brought to everything. Not cold, but not hungry for it either. Not a man who'd been waiting for the town's approval. A man who had been doing what he was going to do regardless, and who had simply, today, done it in front of witnesses. She thought, that's the difference. That was the thing nobody in this town had understood until they'd been in that room and watched him stand up with his dead father's survey notes and his dead wife's lilies still fresh in his memory and talk calmly about land boundaries. Not the grief, not the strangeness, the fact that he had never once been doing any of it for anyone else. People who do things for other people, she'd observed, have a particular quality of needing you to notice. They lean toward the attention, even slightly, even without meaning to. Silas Rowan didn't lean at all. And the people filing out of that hearing room, she could see, were beginning, slowly, imperfectly, in the halting way that towns change their minds about things, to understand what that meant. It meant he was the real thing. And the real thing, she thought, watching him talk to Hank Dunmore about fence posts with the same undivided attention he brought to talking to a woman 12 years gone on a hill under an oak tree. The real thing was, it turned out, contagious. You could catch it just from being nearby. Bess Calloway appeared at Clara's elbow. "Next Friday," she said, without preamble, without her usual performance of knowing things, just straight and a little unsteady the way people are when they're trying to be different than they've been. "When he comes in for the flowers. I'd like to be there." Clara looked at her. "Why?" Bess was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something to him." "What?" "I don't know yet," Bess said, "but I'll know when it's time." Clara looked back at Silas, still talking to Hank, the pale April sun on the side of his weathered face, his documents tucked under his arm, his horse tied at the post, with the patient authority of a very reliable animal. "All right," she said, "Friday." The thing was, she didn't know then, couldn't have known, that Friday was going to be different from any Friday that had come before it. She didn't know that by the time the week was out, Grover's Hollow would have rearranged itself around something it hadn't had a word for until it saw it demonstrated in a county hearing room by a man with his dead father's papers and his dead wife's flowers, and 13 years of a promise held intact against all the weather the world could throw at it. She didn't know that Bess Calloway would bring 2 other women with her on Friday morning, and that Tom Briggs would come in without buying anything and stand by the door with his hat in his hands, and that old Mrs. Hatch would come in for her dried lavender and stay, and that the bell above the door would ring more times that one Friday morning than it had rung in any single day Clara could remember. She didn't know any of it yet. What she knew, standing on the steps of the commissioner's building in April sunlight with Bess Calloway beside her and Silas Rowan 20 feet away, talking about fence posts like it was any ordinary Tuesday, was that something had shifted. Not fixed. Nothing was fixed. The state review was still 6 months away, and Pritchard was still the sheriff, and the winter before the spring was never entirely done, making trouble. But shifted. The way ground shifts when something that has been pressing against it for a long time finally gives, just slightly, just enough to let the air back in. She put her hands in her coat pockets. Her fingers found the edge of the folded paper. Her own handwriting, her father's intelligence, Silas's land, and she held it there for a moment, not pulling it out, just holding it. The gray mare was tied at the post across the road, looking at her with the philosophical patience of an animal that knew it was going home eventually and had decided that was enough to know. Clara walked down the steps and across the road and untied her. She didn't look back this time either, but she was smiling, just slightly, in the private way of someone who has said the true thing and waited and watched it, finally, begin to work. The Friday after the hearing was the one Clara would remember for the rest of her life, though not for the reasons she'd expected. She'd anticipated something, some version of what Bess had promised, people coming in, something slightly larger than the ordinary transaction she'd grown used to. She'd stayed up Thursday night trimming the lilies herself by lamplight, taking more care than usual, cutting the stems at the right angle, and setting them in water overnight so they'd open just enough by morning without going too far. Prairie roses she'd had in since Tuesday. She'd wrapped the bundle the night before and then unwrapped it and rewrapped it because the twine had sat crooked the first time, which was not something she'd have noticed on any other Thursday, which told her she was nervous, which was not a thing she examined too directly. At 9:10, Bess Calloway came in. She brought Martha Hensley, who ran the town's small lending library, from the front room of her house, and a woman Clara knew only slightly, Ruth Alcott, whose husband farmed wheat north of town and who had, according to Bess, cried when she heard the story. Clara had not asked which part. They stood together near the back of the shop, not making a production of their presence, talking quietly among themselves. Clara appreciated that. She'd been worried about it feeling like a performance, like an audience assembled to watch a man's private grief become public spectacle. But Bess had calibrated it right, or had gotten lucky, which amounted to the same thing this morning. Tom Briggs came in at 9:20. He stood by the door, hat in hand, and when Clara looked at him, he shrugged slightly, which she interpreted as, "I know how I've talked about him. I know what that was. I'm here now." She gave him a small nod. It was enough. Old Mrs. Hatch came in for her dried lavender at 9:45, as she did every Friday, and stopped when she saw the small gathering in the back of the shop. She looked at Clara. "Something happening?" she asked. "Just a Friday," Clara said. Mrs. Hatch bought her lavender. She didn't leave. The bell rang at 10 past 10. Silas stopped in the doorway. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man. But he stopped because the shop was not empty the way it always was at 10 past 10 on a Friday morning, and whatever internal system he used to assess unfamiliar situations was doing its work. He looked at the people. Bess, Martha, Ruth, Tom, Mrs. Hatch. He looked at Clara behind the counter. Clara put the bundle on the counter. Lilies and prairie roses, brown paper, plain twine. "It's a busy morning," she said, in the same tone she used for any morning. He walked to the counter. He set his coins down. She pushed them back across to him. She'd stopped putting up an argument about it. They both understood the coins went to the Holloway Fund. It had become a thing between them that needed no words. He picked up the flowers. Bess Calloway stepped forward. Not far. Just enough to close some of the distance between where she'd been standing and where he was. She was holding her handbag with both hands, the way people hold things when their hands need something to do. "Mr. Rowan," she said. Her voice was steadier than Clara expected. "I owe you an apology. I've said unkind things about you in this town. About what you do on Fridays." She stopped, swallowed. "I didn't understand it, and instead of trying to understand it, I made it into a joke. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The shop was very quiet. Silas looked at her. Clara watched him, trying to read what was happening in his face, and found, as she often found, that he didn't give much away, not because he was cold, but because he processed things in a different place than most people, somewhere internal and unhurried that the rest of the world didn't have access to. "Thank you," he said. Not stiff, not gracious in the performed way, just receiving it the way he received most things, matter-of-factly, without making the other person feel they'd done something remarkable, which was, Clara thought, the best way to accept an apology. It let the person keep their dignity. Tom Briggs said something similar, shorter. Tom was not a man built for speeches, more along the lines of "I talked out of turn and I shouldn't have," but he meant it, which Clara could hear, and Silas received it the same way. Martha Hensley, who had not said anything unkind about Silas as far as Clara knew, but had apparently decided that proximity to kindness required its own participation, said, "Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman." Just that. No more. Something happened in Silas's face. Not breaking. That wasn't the right word for it. More like the thing that happens to very old walls when the pressure that has been holding them rigid for years eases just slightly. Not collapse, just settling. Just the very particular shift of something that has been braced for a long time being, for a moment, allowed to simply stand. "She was," he said. "She was a remarkable woman." He looked at the flowers in his hands, then he looked at Clara, and in the look was something she'd been watching him build towards since November, since the Tuesday he'd come in early and told her about Evelyn, since the March morning she'd followed him to the hill and watched him sit with his hand on the stone. It was not a simple look. It was the kind that has too many things in it to read quickly, the kind you come back to later and piece apart, and even then you're not sure you got all of it. He nodded. He walked out. Through the front window, Clara watched him mount his horse and ride east with the flowers against his chest. Nobody in the shop said anything for a moment. Then Mrs. Hatch said, to no one in particular, "Well?" And then she left, which was, Clara had to admit, as close to poetry as Mrs. Hatch ever came. April became May without the dramatic rupture that winter to spring usually required on the prairie, just a slow warming that crept in under the door and settled in for good. And with it came something shifting in the daily texture of the town that Clara noticed but couldn't have described precisely. The way you notice a room has been rearranged, not because you can identify what's moved, but because the light falls differently. People talked about Silas differently. Not everyone, not all at once, not in the complete reversal that stories like to pretend happened after moments of revelation. Some people kept their opinions exactly where they were and weren't interested in adjusting them. But the middle, the large, slightly amorphous middle of a small town that had been going along with the prevailing narrative because prevailing narratives are easier than thinking, the middle had begun to renegotiate. She heard it in small ways. In the feed store, where Tom Briggs had stopped telling the story about the cowboy who talked to his dead wife and started telling a different one, about the fence dispute, about the deed from 1871, about a man who'd walked into a county hearing with his father's handwriting and left with his land intact. She heard it in the way people who saw Silas on the road, which wasn't often, he was not a man who dawdled in town, had started to nod to him first rather than waiting for him to go past. Small things. The kind of things that didn't announce themselves but accumulated. Pritchard did not take the hearing's outcome quietly. Clara had not expected him to. I was a man who had arranged his sense of himself around winning and the particular injury of not winning in public. In a public room, in front of people who had come to watch, was the kind of injury that either taught a man something or curdled into something worse. With Pritchard, it curdled. She saw it first in May, when there were two minor incidents on the East Road. A gate on the Rowan property left open in a way that let 3 cows wander to the neighboring land, which cost Silas half a day, and some strained patience with the Mercer brothers, who were decent men but didn't enjoy having other people's cows on their spring grass. Then a delivery he'd been expecting from the hardware merchant in Dodge City went missing for 10 days and turned up in the wrong storage facility, which was the kind of thing that could be an accident and could be something else. Clara didn't have proof. She just had her father's habit of paying attention and her own accumulated understanding of what men like Pritchard did when they lost officially and still held all the unofficial mechanisms of a small county in their hands. She told Silas what she suspected on a Friday in late May, when the shop smelled like the first good lilies of the proper season and the prairie roses were as vivid as she'd seen them in years. He listened. He said, "I know." "You know about the gate?" "I know about the gate and the delivery and the 2 conversations Pritchard has had with my bank about whether my land deed is sufficient collateral for a previous loan, which it is, clearly, but the question was designed to make the bank nervous." He said it flatly, without theater. "Pritchard isn't subtle. He's just persistent." Clara felt the cold thing move through her again. "He's going after your credit. He's trying to." Silas looked at the flowers. "The bank manager is a man named Colton, Arthur Colton. He's been in this county his whole life, and he was not born yesterday, and he doesn't enjoy being used as an instrument." He paused. "I spoke to him last week. He told me Pritchard had made inquiries and that he, Colton, had found the inquiries unpersuasive." Clara looked at him. "You talked to the bank manager?" "I've been banking with Arthur Colton since I was 22 years old," Silas said, with the mild patience of a man explaining something obvious. "He knew my father. He knew Evelyn. He came to her funeral, which is more than most people in this town did." Clara sat with that for a moment. She'd been building what she privately thought of as her picture of Silas, assembling him from the pieces he gave her, which were never many at once. And she was aware that she kept finding rooms she hadn't known were there. Not because he'd been hiding them, because she'd been working with incomplete information and making assumptions the way people make assumptions about someone who doesn't give much away. "You've been handling this," she said. "I've been handling what I can handle," he said. "And you've been handling the parts I didn't know about. That's—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence, tried again. "That's not something I knew how to ask for. I didn't know I needed it until it was already happening." It was, she thought, probably the most he'd said in a single direction in all the time she'd known him. She treated it carefully, the way you treat something you don't want to damage by handling it too much. "You don't have to ask for it," she said. "That's rather the point." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the flowers and left, which was what he always did, and Clara stood in her shop in the May morning and felt something that she was not going to name yet, because naming things too early had a way of making them complicated before they were ready to be, and she had enough complicated at the moment. The State Land Office responded in late June. The letter came to Silas directly, with a copy to the county commissioner's office, which was the procedure, and it said what Clara had believed it would say based on everything she'd read and everything her father had known, that the Rowan deed of 1871 was valid, that the 1889 boundary survey was confirmed by the state's own records, that the eastern fence line as established by that survey was the legal boundary of the property, and that no further dispute of this boundary would be entertained at the county level without state authorization, which would require a standard of evidence that the letter noted in language so bureaucratic it was almost funny had not been approached by the current claimant. Silas brought the letter to her shop on a Tuesday, another Tuesday, because it kept being Tuesdays when significant things happened, which Clara had begun to find quietly amusing. He set it on the counter, and she read it while he stood there. She read it twice. Then she put it down and said, "It's over." "The land part," he said. "Pritchard will make things unpleasant." "Pritchard has been making things unpleasant for going on 9 months," he said. "I've survived it. I expect I'll continue to." He could still... Clara. He said her name the way he'd started saying it after the hearing, the same way he'd said it that first time, just the one word, just her name, but with a particular quality of attention behind it that she'd stopped trying not to notice. "It's over." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "It's over." She felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't fully registered was knotted. He didn't leave immediately, which was unusual. He was almost always moving toward the door by this point in any Friday-adjacent visit. He stood on the other side of the counter from her in the May-becoming June light, and he said, "I want to show you something, on Sunday, if you're willing." "What something?" "The hill," he said, properly. "Not..." He paused, and she understood that he knew she'd followed him, had probably known for some time, had chosen to say nothing because that too was something he'd processed internally and decided was all right, in the way he decided most things, quietly, without involving anyone else in the deliberation. Not from a distance. Clara felt the weight of what he was offering. Not a light thing. Not casual. The hill was the most private geography in his life. More private than the ranch, more private than anything, and he was saying, "Come there, properly. Be a witness who is welcome." "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Sunday came with the particular quality of a June morning on the Kansas prairie that always surprised her, no matter how many of them she'd lived through. The way the light came in low and golden before the heat built, the way the grass was still wet, and the whole world smelled temporarily clean. She rode the gray mare east, and Silas was waiting at the road to his property, already mounted, and they rode together without talking much, which was comfortable in the way that silences between people who understand each other are comfortable. Not awkward, not empty, just the conversation that doesn't need words having its turn. The hill was the same as when she'd seen it from a distance. The oak tree, wide-armed and old, its leaves full now in June, casting a moving shade over the two stones. The grass grew long around them, not neglected. She could see it had been trimmed back at the edges, but left with the natural quality of a place where someone had decided the prairie should stay the prairie. She stood back while Silas knelt and put the flowers. He'd brought flowers, of course. It was a Sunday, but he'd brought them. She'd seen him carrying them from his saddlebag, against the left stone. The stone that said Evelyn Rose Rowan. Beloved. Simple as that. 2 words that said the thing completely. He was quiet for a minute. Clara stood under the oak tree with her hands in her coat pockets and looked out at the prairie spreading east and felt the largeness of it. The particular Kansas largeness that could make you feel very small or very free, depending on the day and what you brought to it. "I tell her things," Silas said. Not to Clara specifically, or not only to Clara. More like he was saying it to the whole morning, or to Evelyn, or to all 3 at once. About the week, the cattle, the fences. A pause. "About you lately." Clara looked at the back of his head. "What do you tell her?" "That you went through your father's papers at 2 in the morning and found something that helped me keep my land." He ran his thumb along the top edge of the stone. "That you followed me here in March and didn't pretend you hadn't. That you're the most stubborn person I've encountered since Evelyn." He was quiet for a moment. She'd consider that high praise. Clara felt something behind her eyes that she was not going to allow at this particular moment. Not because it wasn't warranted, but because she wasn't ready. And there was something important about being ready, about receiving things in the right order. "What else do you tell her?" she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. "That I don't know what to do with what I'm feeling," he said simply. "I haven't known for a while, so I tell her and she doesn't answer, obviously, but the telling helps me figure it out. He stood up, turned to face Clara. I figured some of it out. The oak tree moved overhead. The prairie light shifted. Silas, she said carefully, what you had with Evelyn, I wouldn't try to be. I know that, he said, not cutting her off, just catching the sentence before it went somewhere wrong. I know that. This isn't. He looked at the stone, then back at her. Evelyn didn't make me promise to spend the rest of my life alone. She made me promise not to go quiet. He paused. I think she'd say those are different things. Clara stood in the grass under the oak tree and looked at the man who had been keeping a promise on this hill for 13 years and understood, with a clarity that arrived not like a revelation, but like something she'd been circling long enough to finally see straight on, that she was in love with him. Had been, probably, since a Tuesday in late October when he'd come in without his coat and told her he might not be here Friday, with the expression of a man who was not used to having anyone care whether he was. She hadn't let herself see it clearly before. There had been too many other things, the practical things, the necessary things, Pritchard and the deed and the hearing. But the practical things were done now. The letter had come. The land was his. The space that had been occupied by urgency was quiet, and in the quiet there was room to see what had been growing in it all along. I think she'd be right, Clara said, about those being different things. Silas looked at her, long enough, and with enough of whatever lived behind his eyes, that she didn't look away. I don't want to rush it, he said. I don't know how to do this. It's been a long time since He stopped. Tried again. I'm probably going to get things wrong. So am I, she said. I'm stubborn, and I make decisions without consulting anyone, and I sometimes bluff when I haven't finished figuring out if the bluff is true yet. I know, he said. I've noticed. Something shifted in the air between them. Not resolved, not complete, not any of the neat conclusive things. Just opened. The way a window opens in a room that's been closed for too long and the air changes, and you didn't know until the air changed how much you'd needed it to. They stood together on the hill for a while longer, not talking much, looking out at the prairie in its full June unfolding, the grass long and moving, the horizon the kind of endless that on the right day, and it was the right day, meant possibility instead of loneliness. Summer moved through Grover's Hollow with its own unhurried authority. The land dispute had faded from the front of most people's attention, replaced by the concerns of a farming county in the height of its working season, drought worries and cattle prices, and the question of whether the road north of town was going to be regraded before fall, which it wasn't, which it never was. Pritchard had gone quiet. Not gone. He was still the sheriff, still occupied his office at the end of Main Street, still wore his polished star with the same practiced visibility. But the particular targeted attention he'd been directing at Silas Rowan had withdrawn, the way pressure withdraws when it finds it is not producing the intended result. Clara didn't trust the quiet. She'd learned from her father's papers and from Bess Calloway's social intelligence, and from her own observation that men like Pritchard didn't change. They waited. They found new angles, new levers, new moments when the room wasn't looking. She kept watching. She kept her father's records in order. She kept the letter from the state land office in a copy in her own desk alongside everything else. But the summer was, within the parameters of what summer in a small Kansas prairie town could be, peaceful. And she let herself have that mostly. She and Silas didn't rush anything. She'd said it and meant it, and so had he, and it turned out that not rushing was not the same as not moving. They moved, just at the pace of two people who had learned separately, and through different hardships, that the thing worth having was worth the time it took to become itself. He came in on Fridays. He came in on occasional Tuesdays. She rode out east twice more, once because there was a question about what to do with her father's desk that she found herself wanting to talk through with someone who understood the weight of keeping things, and once simply because it was a good morning and she wanted to. He came to look at the backroom ceiling again in July and found two more boards that needed replacing and replaced them without being asked. They had dinner together once, at her kitchen table, which she'd cooked badly and he'd eaten without complaint, which she appreciated more than if he'd lied about it being good. My cooking is a work in progress, she told him. Most things are, he said, which was such a Silas answer that she laughed, and he watched her laugh with the expression of a man who was slightly surprised by how much he liked the sound of it. The Fridays were still his Fridays. She never forgot that and never tried to make them anything else. He went to the hill every week with the flowers she'd wrapped, and she had come to understand that this was not a wound that needed managing, but a truth that needed honoring. That Evelyn was part of who he was, had been for 13 years, and would continue to be, and that a person who wanted to be in Silas Rowan's life was a person who made room for that without requiring him to diminish it. She did not find this difficult, which surprised her. She'd thought she might. She was only human, and humans have complicated feelings about the dead who have claims on the living. But the thing was, she knew Evelyn, knew her from what Silas had told her, and from what she'd pieced together, and from what she felt in the air on that hill under the oak tree. Prairie roses smell like the world is trying again. A woman who had wanted her husband not to go quiet. She knew the shape of her. And what she felt toward the shape of her was not jealousy, but something more like gratitude, which surprised her every time she found it there. September came. The land had settled into its golden end-of-season look, the grass going amber, the morning sharpening with the first real suggestion of the fall that was coming. The state land office letter had been in Silas's files for 3 months. The county commission had moved on to other disputes, other complications. Arthur Colton at the bank had sent a brief note saying that all Rowan accounts were in good standing and he hoped the year was treating the property well. It was on a September Friday, a morning with a sky so blue it seemed almost aggressive, that Clara was trimming the last of the season's prairie roses when Bess Calloway came in, not in her usual information-gathering way, but slowly, with the look of a person who has something to say and is not sure of the landing. "I heard something," Bess said. Clara kept trimming. "You usually have." "About Pritchard." Bess set her handbag on the counter. "He's leaving." Clara's hand stopped. "Leaving?" "His wife has family in Missouri. There's talk of an appointment. Something in a smaller county, further east, where nobody knows about the hearing." Bess's mouth did something complicated. "Or so Hank Dunmore's brother heard from the county clerk's office." Clara set the scissors down. She looked at Bess. "Is it confirmed?" "Nothing's confirmed until it's confirmed," Bess said, which was true and was also Bess's way of covering herself if she was wrong. "But the clerk's brother said the paperwork's been requested." She paused. "I thought you should know. And Rowan." After Bess left, Clara stood in her shop with the prairie roses half trimmed and the September light coming through the front window at the low angle it came through in September, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel since October of the previous year, when all of this had begun in earnest, when Silas had come in on a Tuesday without his coat and the tight look on his face. She felt the genuine possibility that it was going to be all right. Not perfect. Not clean. Pritchard leaving didn't undo the gossip of years or the 9 months of pressure or the gate left open or the delivery gone missing. It didn't undo the hearing or the cold February visits or the many Friday mornings she'd spent watching the clock work its way toward 10 past 10. It didn't make the world simpler or people better or the land disputes of eastern Kansas any less certain to reassemble themselves in some new form around some new person eventually. But it was the possibility that it was going to be all right, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, quite a lot. Which was, she thought, probably what prairie roses smelled like. Not happiness exactly, not certainty, but the world trying. The world actually trying. She picked the scissors back up. She finished trimming the roses. She wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with plain twine and set them on the counter. And when the bell above the door rang at 10 past 10, she was ready. He looked, she thought, better than he had in the fall of the previous year. The tightness was gone from around his eyes. The shape of him in the doorway had a different quality. Not looser, exactly. Silas was not a loose man, but not braced. Just standing, just being where he was, without the posture of a man who expects the next thing to require defending against. "There's news," she said. "About Pritchard." He set his coins on the counter. She pushed them back. "I heard," he said. "Arthur Colton told me yesterday." She looked at him. "Are you glad?" He thought about it, which was what he did, actually thought, didn't reach for the first available answer. "I'm relieved," he said finally. "Glad feels like too much energy for a man I've spent too much energy on already." She smiled. "That's a very reasonable position." "I have them occasionally." Something was in his face. The ghost of a smile thing, but easier than it used to be, less like something testing unfamiliar territory. "Clara." "Yes." When the season changes, he said, when it's properly fall and the first frost is coming. He stopped, reformulated. I'd like to bring you to the hill. When I go, if you'd be willing. She understood what he was asking. Not the same as her following him alone in March. Not the same as him bringing her on a June Sunday to show her something he wanted her to see. This was different. This was asking her to be present in a way that meant a permanent thing, a going forward thing, a thing that would change what Fridays meant without taking away what they'd always meant. She understood he'd thought about it for a long time, probably had been thinking about it since June, probably had told Evelyn about it on the hill, in the weeks between then and now, and had worked out, in the private, unhurried, internal way he worked everything out, that it was something Evelyn would have wanted, because Evelyn had not wanted him to go quiet, and going to the hill alone forever was a kind of quietness that had a different name but was the same thing underneath. Yes, Clara said. I'd be willing. He picked up the flowers. He rode east. And Clara Whitlock stood in her shop on a September Friday with the blue sky pressing against the front window and the season turning around her, and she felt the year beginning to gather itself towards something she didn't have a word for yet, but intended to find one for. In time, in the unhurried way of people who have learned that the things worth naming deserve to be gotten right. The first frost came on a Thursday night in mid-October. Clara knew it before she opened her eyes the next morning. The quality of the silence was different, the particular held-breath stillness of a world that had gone rigid overnight. She lay in bed for a moment listening to it, then got up and dressed in the dark and went downstairs to the shop, where she lit the lamp and stood in the pre-dawn cold checking the flowers she'd kept near the stove for exactly this reason. The lilies had made it. The prairie roses, the last of the season, she'd known it when she'd gotten them in 2 weeks ago, had known these were the final ones before the growers would switch to winter stock. The prairie roses had made it too. A little tender at the edges of the outer petals, nothing that wouldn't pass for beautiful if you weren't looking for imperfection, and she was not looking for imperfection this morning. She wrapped them with more care than usual, which she hadn't thought was possible until she was doing it, and tied the twine and set the bundle on the counter. Then she went upstairs and changed into her riding clothes. She had not told anyone she was going. It wasn't a secret. She simply hadn't announced it, the way you don't announce the private things even when they're not private anymore. Bess Calloway would find out eventually, which meant the town would find out eventually, which was fine. The town finding out eventually was, she'd come to understand, one of the mechanisms by which the world corrected itself, imperfectly and slowly and not without backsliding, but corrected nonetheless. People needed to know that a thing was possible before they could believe in it, and before they could believe in it, someone had to do it first without asking permission. Silas was waiting at the East Road, as he'd said he would be. He was on the brown horse, which was getting old. She'd noticed over the summer that it moved a little more carefully than it had when she'd first started watching him ride east from the window of her shop, favoring its left foreleg on the harder ground. Though it was still reliable, still willing. He was holding something under his arm that she recognized without needing to look directly at. He'd brought 2 bundles. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't explain it. She understood without either of them making it into a discussion. He'd brought flowers for Evelyn, and he'd brought flowers for the morning, for the occasion of her being there, and the 2 things were not in competition with each other. They rode east together in the frost-sharp air. The Dunmore property was quiet. The old barn that had been losing its argument with gravity all year had finally surrendered one of its side walls at some point in the night, and they rode past it with the morning light catching the raw new exposure of the boards that had been hidden inside it for 40 years. Clara looked at it and thought about the way things that seem permanent are always in negotiation with time, and time wins, always wins, but what the things contain doesn't disappear just because the walls do. The hill looked different in the frost. The oak tree had gone fully bare since her last visit, its wide arms reaching without leaves, and the grass around the stones had gone the pale amber of late autumn, standing stiff and silver-edged in the cold. The stones themselves had a rim of white along their tops, where the frost had settled and held. Silas dismounted and she dismounted, and they walked up together. He knelt at Evelyn's stone and arranged the flowers the way he always did, and Clara stood back as she had on that June Sunday, because some things belonged to him alone and always would, and being a witness was different from participating, and she knew the difference. He talked for a while. She couldn't hear the words clearly. The wind off the open prairie moved them away from her, and she didn't try to hear them. She looked out east at the horizon, at the particular clarity of an October morning after the first frost, when the air had been washed clean of everything soft, and what was left was just the true shape of things, the land, the sky, the enormous indifferent beauty of the world going about its business, regardless of what any of them wanted from it. Then he stood up and came to stand beside her. "I told her about you," he said, "properly. Not the way I'd been telling her. Not the pieces of it. All of it." Clara kept her eyes on the horizon. "What did you tell her?" "That you are the most difficult, most clear-sighted, most unexpectedly brave person I've known since her." He was quiet for a moment. "That I don't know how to love someone new without it being some kind of conversation with who I was when I loved her. And that I think she'd understand that, because she always understood how I worked better than I did." Clara turned to look at him. "Do you think she minds?" He thought about it. Genuinely considered it the way he considered everything from the inside out. "No," he said. "She'd mind if I stopped coming here. She'd mind if I forgot her. She wouldn't mind this." A pause. She wasn't that kind of person. The frost was already beginning to soften in the morning sun, the silver edges of the grass releasing their grip. Clara looked at the two stones, Evelyn's on the left, the smaller one on the right that said simply, "Silas Rowan Sr., 1821-1893, rancher." She hadn't noticed that one properly before, had known it was there but not read it. Father and son, she thought, buried near each other without planning it that way. The things that pull. "He's here too," she said. "Started as my father's land," Silas said. "He's the one who should be on it." He looked at the two stones, the way people look at things they've looked at so many times. The looking has gone somewhere underneath ordinary seeing. Evelyn didn't want to be anywhere else either. She said the hill was the place she felt most herself. She said it was the only place where the size of the sky didn't feel like it was trying to swallow you. It just felt like room. Clara understood that. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had grown up on the Kansas prairie and had spent years making herself small in the space of her father's shop and her father's expectations and her own loneliness, and who had needed to find out slowly that the size of things didn't have to mean diminishment. She was right, Clara said. She usually was, Silas said, and the sadness in it was clean and familiar, the sadness of someone who has carried a loss long enough to know exactly the shape of it, not sharp anymore, but always present, like a stone in a pocket. You stop noticing its weight because you've learned to balance around it. He put the second bundle of flowers into her hands, not ceremoniously. Just handed them over the way you hand someone something they've been meaning to carry. She held them and didn't know what to do with them exactly. And then she understood that not knowing was fine, that this was not a procedure with right and wrong steps. It was just two people on a hill in October, and she set them against the base of the oak tree because that felt right, and they stood there together in the frost-releasing morning for a while without speaking, which was the best kind of standing there. Pritchard left Grover's Hollow on a Wednesday in November, in the way people leave places they've stopped winning in, with the speed of someone who doesn't want to be watched going. Clara heard about it from Bess, who had heard about it from the deputy, who had been given the news on a Monday with 2 days' notice and had taken it with the equanimity of a man who had always suspected the arrangement was temporary. A new sheriff was appointed from within the county, a quiet man named Garrett Fields, who had been a deputy in Hays City, and who came to his new position with no obvious agenda, which was itself a kind of relief so profound that Grover's Hollow barely knew what to do with it. Clara did not feel triumphant about Pritchard's departure. She'd expected to, had thought she might feel the particular satisfaction of watching a man who'd tried to take something from someone she cared about leave without what he'd come for. But what she actually felt was mostly just the absence of attention she'd been carrying for a year, which is a different thing from triumph. Triumph implies a clean conclusion. This was more like a muscle unclenching, not a victory, just the end of the bracing. Silas heard the news the same day she did, and when she told him, what he said was, "Good. I hope he does better somewhere else." And he meant it, which was something she'd had to sit with for a while. The capacity of a man who had been systematically pushed and harried for nearly a year to wish his harrier well in some abstract, genuine way. She'd asked him about it, later. "Hating people takes more than I've got," he said. "Not noble about it, just practical. I've got the ranch, and the cattle, and Fridays, and now," he stopped, "I've got things worth spending what I have on." She'd thought about that for a long time afterward. There was a lesson in it that she suspected she'd be unfolding for years. The way you unfold something that was given to you in a compressed form and keep finding new things inside it. Not that anger was wrong or that injustice should be absorbed without response. She'd responded actively with her father's papers and her bluff in the shop and her presence at the county hearing. But response was different from corrosion. You could fight for something without letting the fighting eat you. You could be clear-eyed about what someone was without making their worst qualities the landlord of your internal life. Silas had been doing that for years, she realized. Had been fighting quietly and carefully for his land, for his name, for his right to ride east on Fridays, without ever letting any of it consume the thing it was meant to protect. She thought that was, in its quiet way, the most impressive thing she'd ever seen a person do. November passed and December came, and the Kansas winter settled in with its usual conviction. The shop was slower in winter, as it always was. Fewer people had occasion for flowers in the cold months, and those who did came in with the purposeful efficiency of people who didn't want to linger in an unheated building. Clara kept the stove burning and worked on her ledgers and reorganized her father's records into a system that made more sense to her than the one he'd built, which was an act she'd been postponing for 2 years because it had felt too much like replacing him, and which she now understood was not replacing him but continuing him, which was different. She put his ledgers in a separate box, clearly labeled Preserved. She built her own system alongside it. The two things coexisted on the shelves in the back room, his handwriting and hers, the two systems of a father and daughter who had been paying attention to the same county from the same counter across 30 years. Silas came in on Fridays. He came in on occasional non-Fridays for reasons that had become less and less about practical needs and more about the simple fact of coming. He stayed longer than he used to. Not all day. He was a ranching man with ranching obligations, and the short winter days had their own demands, but long enough. They talked about the cattle and the roof that she was going to need to address properly before another winter, and the Dunmore brothers who had decided not to sell after all, which had surprised most people and had not surprised Silas, who said he'd always thought they'd find a reason to stay when it came to it. They talked about her father sometimes. He told her more about the friendship their fathers had had. Not close, as he'd said, but the kind of knowing that comes from being in the same place long enough. He told her that her father had shaken his hand like a grown man at age 10 or 11, and that the memory had stayed because nobody had done it before, and very few people had done it since, and that it had mattered in the particular way that being seen clearly at an early age matters. It gets into the foundation of you, becomes part of what you think is possible. He was a good man, Silas said, one December afternoon with snow coming in against the front window. Not easy, but good. No, Clara agreed. Not easy. She looked at the window. He would have liked you. You think so? He liked people who said what they meant and did what they said. She paused. You're the most extreme example of that I've encountered. Silas looked at her sideways. I'm not sure if that's a compliment. It's an observation, she said. Make of it what you will. She was fairly certain it was a compliment. She was fairly certain he knew that. The marriage happened in March. Not the first March of this story, but the second. The March after the October frost and the November departure and the December afternoons with snow against the window and the January and February that were, as Kansas Januaries and Februaries almost always are, a test of everyone's patience with the concept of seasons. It was a quiet ceremony, which suited them both. A thing with the county justice and Bess Calloway and Hank Dunmore and Arthur Colton from the bank, who cried, which surprised everyone, including himself. Clara wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, and she carried prairie roses because they weren't yet in season, and she'd had to write to the Missouri grower in January to arrange them, which had involved more correspondence than she'd initially planned, and had arrived with 2 days to spare and had been worth every letter. Silas wore a coat that was not the one from when she'd first known him. That one had finally given up the ghost in February, had developed a hole in the lining that had become 2 holes, and then a general structural crisis, and he'd replaced it with a similar one. Same function, different history, broken in more slowly. Claire had found this both perfectly him and quietly moving, the way some things were. He still called her Clara. She called him Silas. They had never been the kind of people who invented new names for each other. The reception was at the ranch, which was the first time many people in Grover's Hollow had been east of the Dunmore property, and which produced, in several of the people who came, a visible recalibration. The recognition that the man they had spent years constructing from rumor and half attention was a man who lived in a place with a good fence and a solid barn and a view east toward the horizon that made you stand still for a moment when you came out of the house, because the prairie and march had that quality, all that light and all that space, and the feeling that the world was, in fact, trying again. Bess Calloway stood beside Clara on the porch at one point in the afternoon and looked out at the view and said, very quietly, "I was wrong about him for a long time." "Yes," Clara said. "You were." Bess looked at her. "You're not going to let me off easy." "I'm going to let you off exactly as easy as you deserve," Clara said, "which is somewhat easy because you apologized and you meant it and you brought 2 women with you on a Friday morning when it mattered. I'm not keeping a tally." She paused. "I just don't see the point of pretending the past didn't happen." Bess was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father raised you right." "He raised me honestly," Clara said, "which isn't always the same thing, but in his case was." They stood on the porch in the March wind and watched the men from town talking to Silas near the fence. Hank Dunmore telling some long story that involved a lot of gesturing. Silas listening with his full attention the way he listened to everything. Tom Briggs nodding at intervals. A gathering of people who had not always been kind to each other, trying to be better, doing it imperfectly, doing it anyway. That was how it always went, Clara thought. That was the only way it ever went. Well, the Fridays did not change. This was the thing that mattered most and that she'd understood before she married him. The Fridays were not going to change, and she was not going to try to change them, and that was not a concession or a compromise. It was the truth of who she'd chosen, and you didn't choose a man for who he was, and then work to make him into someone easier. She went with him sometimes. Not every week. Some Fridays were his alone, as they had always been, as they would always be. But some Fridays she rode east beside him and stood on the hill under the bare or leafing or full summer oak and brought her own flowers, which she'd started doing after the first frost October. A smaller bunch, a different arrangement, something that said, "I'm not here to replace or to compete. I'm just here. I'm part of this now." She had started talking too. Not every visit. But sometimes, quietly, she said things to Evelyn Stone the way you speak to the absence of someone who mattered. Not expecting an answer, not performing grief, just acknowledging a presence that had shaped a person she loved, and therefore had shaped her too, whether any of them had planned it that way. She said, "He kept his promise." She said it more than once, on different Fridays, in different seasons, because it felt important to say, and because the hill was, she'd found, the place where you could say the true things without needing to be careful about how they landed. He kept his promise. That was the whole of it, the simplest possible thing and the rarest. She had grown up watching people make promises the way they made plans, with the intention of keeping them right up until the moment keeping them became difficult, at which point the promise became negotiable, became contextual, became a thing that had made sense at the time but couldn't reasonably be expected to survive changed circumstances. She'd watched her father keep his promises and understood it was unusual. She'd watched the town of Grover's Hollow make its assumptions about a quiet man's grief and understand that what looked like strangeness from the outside was simply someone doing what they'd said they would do, in conditions that made it hard, without asking for recognition. The world had very little patience for that kind of person, she'd found. It didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't performing their virtue, wasn't keeping score, wasn't waiting for credit. It called them strange. It made up stories about them. It tried, in the case of Dale Pritchard, to take their land. And then the world, imperfectly, slowly, never completely, looked again. The county held a small commemoration in the autumn of the following year. Not for Silas specifically. It wasn't that kind of county, and he wasn't that kind of man. But for the restoration of several historical land records that had been in dispute, of which the Rowan deed was the most prominent. Commissioner Webb, who had made the right call under pressure and had apparently decided to continue making right calls with increasing consistency, said a few words about the importance of historical documentation and the rights of established landowners, which was as close to an apology as public officials usually got, and which Silas received with the same equanimity he received everything. Afterward, in the parking area outside the commissioner's building, Hank Dunmore's youngest son, A boy of about 12, red-haired and direct in the way of children who haven't yet learned to be otherwise, walked up to Silas and said, "Is it true you bring flowers to your wife's grave every Friday?" Silas looked at the boy. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because I said I would." The boy thought about this. "Even in winter?" "Especially in winter," Silas said. "That's when it's harder. That's when it matters more." The boy nodded slowly, in the way children nod when they're filing something away for later, when they know they've heard something important even if they can't yet explain why. Then he ran back to his father, and Silas watched him go, and Clara, standing beside him, watched Silas watch the boy. "He'll remember that," she said. "Maybe," Silas said. "He will," she said. "The things you hear at 12 that you don't understand yet, those are the ones that come back, when you need them." He looked at her sideways. "Speaking from experience?" "My father shook your hand like a grown man when you were 12, she said. "You remembered it 40 years later, so yes, speaking from experience." He was quiet for a moment, and in his face was the thing she had come to know best about him. The particular quality of a person genuinely receiving something, not deflecting it, not minimizing it, just letting it in. He'd been doing that more, she'd noticed, over the past year. Not dramatically. He was still Silas, would always be Silas. But the edges were slightly different, like a door that had been stuck a long time and had been, slowly, worked free. "You're going to be good at this," he said. "At what?" "At being the person who notices things," he said. "There are people who see and people who notice. You notice." He looked back at where the boy had gone. "That's rarer." It was, she thought later, the best thing anyone had ever said to her. Better than most of the things people said in the formal moments that were supposed to be the important ones. Because it was true, and it was said plainly, and it asked nothing of her in return. That was love, she had decided. Not the formal moments, the noticing, the plain true things said without asking for anything back. The world did not make it easy to be that kind of person, or to love that kind of person. The world preferred noise, preferred visible effort, preferred the kind of devotion that announced itself and took up space. It had been suspicious of Silas for 13 years because his devotion was quiet, because he asked for nothing, because he just kept going. Every Friday, in whatever weather, whatever the year had handed him, however the county was behaving, and whatever the sheriff thought about the eastern fence line, he just kept going. She thought about what it had cost him, not the practical things, the money, the land dispute, the year of Pritchard's pressure. The other cost, the one that didn't show in any ledger, the cost of being misunderstood for years by people who should have been his neighbors and weren't. Not really. Not until they had to sit in a county hearing room and watch him stand up with his dead father's papers and understand, finally, that the strange, quiet cowboy had been the truest person in the county all along. People paid for being genuine in ways that weren't fair. She'd known that from her own life, from her father's life. But what Silas had demonstrated, without intending to demonstrate anything, which was the whole point, was that the cost was payable, that you could pay it and remain intact, that keeping a promise in the dark, when no one was watching, when no one was going to reward you for it, was not only possible, but was the thing that made you someone worth knowing when the light finally came. She hoped the boy remembered it. She hoped the town remembered it, in the slow, imprecise way that towns remembered things. Not as a story with a moral, but as a texture, a quality that got into the air of a place and changed what people expected from each other. She hoped that somewhere in the fabric of Grover's Hollow, in all the years to come, was the fact of Silas Rowan riding east on Fridays, and the thing that meant. Many years later, more than either of them counted, because counting made it about numbers, and it wasn't about numbers. On a Friday morning in October that had the same frostbitten quality as the first October she'd ridden east with him, Clara sat on the hill under the oak tree and watched the prairie do what it always did, which was to go on, which was to refuse to be finished with itself. She was older, they both were. The gray mare was long gone, and her replacement, and that one's replacement. The ranch had outlasted 3 sets of fence posts and 2 barn rebuilds, and 1 summer drought that had required the kind of cooperation from neighbors that the town had, by then, learned to give without waiting to be asked. The oak tree was bigger. That was the thing about old trees. They kept going in ways that made your own years feel modest. It was a different shade under it than it had been, denser, more committed. Evelyn's stone had weathered to the point where the letters were softer, needed touching to read clearly, which Clara did sometimes, ran her fingers over the carved letters the way you read something in the dark. Silas was beside her. He was slower getting up from kneeling than he used to be, and he didn't pretend otherwise, which was something she'd always loved about him. He didn't perform vitality he didn't have. He sat next to her in the grass, and they looked east together at the horizon. "Next Friday," he said. "Next Friday," she agreed. They had not stopped coming, that was all, that was everything. They had not stopped coming, and they were not going to stop coming, and the flowers were on the stone, and the air smelled of frost and distant things, and the prairie was going on in its enormous, indifferent way, and they were still here, still present, still paying attention. She thought, the world tries. On a hill in October with the frost on the grass and the old oak tree overhead, and the two stones that held the name of a man she loved, and the name of a woman who had made him someone worth loving, the world tries, and sometimes the trying is enough, and sometimes you have to be the trying yourself, and you do it anyway. You do it anyway, every Friday.